everybody, it's Nina. Thanks for joining me today. Today, as many of you know, is the STAMPtember Simon Says Stamp Tim Holtz exclusive release. And this stamp set and also coordinating stencil set is fabulous for creating some really great winter cards. So here's a look at the stamp set. This set features a variety of different images from many of Tim's September release products with Stampers Anonymous, such as holiday postmarks, carved Christmas, great outdoors, sparkles in Christmas, and then also the stencil features images from Starry, Peppermint, and Merry Christmas. So I used many of the images from both the stencil and the stamp set. What you're seeing me do here is take the stamp sets out of the rubber that they come in. Most of Tim's Stampers Anonymous stamp sets come this way. So I took them out, and now I have my paper. This is a piece of watercolor paper that I applied some grit paste onto using the starry part of the stencil. I applied the grit paste, and while it was still wet, I added a little bit of rock candy distress glitter on top of that. I set that aside to dry, and while it dried, I worked on creating other elements for my card, including my piece of vellum, which was die cut with a Hero Arts postage stamp die, and I'm using the peppermint strip of the stencil to ink on some aged mahogany and fired brick ink colors. These blend really easily on the vellum, and it's actually kind of hard to get a little shading because the vellum is so slick, but very carefully I just kind of dabbed a little bit of the darker shading in certain areas of the stencil, and that just gave me a slight variation in tone to that ink blending. I applied masks on either side of the stencil to help me make sure I didn't get any ink on opposite ends of that stripe, and then I just continued adding that stripe all across this piece of vellum. Now, because I used distress inks, I can take some water and flick that onto the ink blending and then lift it off with a dry rag, and that creates some really fun water splatters. It also gives that panel a bit of texture and interest. I actually die cut some vellum with that postage die multiple times, about 3 times, and then I layered those 3 pieces behind the piece that I added the ink blending onto. What this did is this created a little bit of a more frostier appearance to the vellum. It's not quite as see-through as just one layer, but it also made that entire piece a little bit more sturdy, which is what I wanted. I also wanted to distress it a little bit because that always works so well with Tim's products. His products look so neat with that distressed feel. So I used some Delicata Golden Glitz ink and an ink blending sponge and put on a bunch of ink along the edges of this piece of vellum. Then I dipped that into some antique gold embossing powder from Simon Says Stamp and heat set that. So what this did was it created a distressed gold edging to the vellum, and it looks really, really cool. And because it's vellum, it curls a little bit once it gets heat put onto it. So as that heat was applied to the vellum, it curled some of the areas that weren't adhered together, and it creates a really neat textured distressed appearance, enhancing that distressed look that we've already added to the vellum. Alright, so now I'm working on creating the winter scene that I have using the deer and some of the trees. So I used some distressed oxide inks and added that onto one of the deer, and I'm going to spritz this with a little bit of water to reactivate the ink that's sitting on that stamp. Now I spritzed it about twice, and that created just enough movement with the ink so that once I stamp this down, the inks blend together so nicely. So as I stamp this down, you're going to see as I lift it off how we get this really great watercolor texture with this deer and the distressed oxide inks. Now, because the oxide inks have that pigment diffusion and they oxidize, they get a really neat chalky texture to them. So I really love the way they dry. I also brought in some of that ice spruce distress oxide ink, and I'm going to use this to create the look of snow that the deer is sitting on. So I added a little bit of shading underneath of the deer itself, and then I'm going to blend that out with a lot of water because I want this to be a little bit dark because this is going to be a night scene, but I also don't want it to be completely gray because I want it to also look like snow. Here I ended up getting a little bit of that browning from the deer onto the snow, but what I did was I actually then started picking that up and moving the brown into other areas of the snow to help make it look like it was intentional because I did kind of mess that up. So just by pulling a little bit more brown into the snow in other areas made it look like I had done that intentionally. So it was a nice way to fix that goof. Now I'm bringing in some green distress oxide inks and adding these on top of the tree images. I stamped the first one onto the corner of the paper, and I also had spritzed this with water before pressing it down. Now I'm going to re-ink that stamp and stamp it again in a slightly lower angle from the first one. After I've stamped both of those, I'm going to bring in the bare tree branch and I'm going to add Distress Oxide inks onto this as well. This time I'm using a couple more browns. I used Antique Linen and Frayed Burlap. Again, I'll spritz this with water to get the ink moving, and I'm going to stamp this twice. I stamped it down towards the bottom of the two trees that I already stamped with the first generation of that ink, and then without adding any water or re-inking the stamp, I added the second generation up towards the top. Now I need to add in some sky. I wanted to gradually add in the sky because I didn't want to get this to be too dark all at once, and I also wanted a lighter area of that ink in the center. So I started off by applying a light wash of the color all the way around this piece. And I did concentrate a little bit more darker color towards the edges, but for the most part this is a fairly light wash all the way around. Now I'm bringing in a slightly darker shade of ink and I'm adding this along the edges and slowly working that towards the middle. These are Faded Jeans and Salty Ocean Distress Oxide inks, and I'm blending the two together as I paint the background here. I'm allowing them to have more of a variegated look, and I also added some of that ink in between the trees as well to make sure that there was no white areas sticking out. I'll keep working on adding those inks along the edges and working them towards the center, again making sure I keep a lighter area until I have the background looking the way I like. Once I have it ready and I'm liking how that the colors are blending, I took more water and added some water splatters to the background as well. Again, that creates a really neat effect with the Oxide inks. Once that was completely dry, and I also heat set it to make sure it was fully dry, I took some of the stars from that stamp and applied those to the background using some embossing ink. I used Ranger's Enchanted Gold embossing powder, which is a really pretty golden color. And then I heat set those to melt the embossing powder, and once they dry, they have almost like a gold iridescent appearance. It's really, really pretty. I pulled one of the sentiments from the set, and I'm going to stamp this onto some teal colored cardstock using, again, some embossing ink. I want the sentiment to be embossed in gold, so I'll stamp the sentiment onto the paper, and then I'll bring in some Simon's Antique Gold embossing powder so that I can melt the sentiment onto the paper. Now I wanted to cut this out, and I wanted to have a little bit of a distressed look to the edges because, again, I want this vintage distressed feel to kind of go along with the entire card. So I took my scissors and free cut kind of like a label shape. I'm being very loose with the cutting, and I'm also kind of making sure I get in a little bit of waves here and there as I cut. So I don't want this to be perfectly straight. I want some areas that are a little bit more rounded and also have a little bit of a bumpy edge to them. So after I cut that out, I'm also going to distress it a little bit by adding some ink along the edges. This is so that it makes the edges a little bit darker, and it kind of enhances the edges a little bit more, so it makes the sentiment strip stand out. So I dunked that into some embossing powder. This is just some clear embossing powder, and I'll melt that as well. And again, you can see as I'm adding the heat onto here and it's melting the powder, it's creating a really great distressed appearance. Okay, so now I've punched some holes into the paper where we had done the stenciling and the glitter powder. I used my craft pick to poke holes all the way down this piece, and now they're not straight at all. And I'm going to use those holes to be guides for stitching onto my card. I wanted to add some stitching detailing along the one side of this panel, but I don't have a sewing machine, so I figured I'd go ahead and hand stitch this. But because I'm hand stitching it, I knew I wasn't going to get this in a perfectly straight line, not very easily. So I decided I would make it look a little bit more imperfect, and I think that actually worked really well for the card itself because I think the wonky kind of feel of the stitching adds to the handmade vintage kind of distressed feel. So I used some blue thread, it's a very pale blue, and I created two lines of stitching and let them overlap and have just a very uneven appearance. So now I'm bringing in that stencil once again. You can see I've added some of that gold distressing along the edges like I did for the vellum piece. Now I'm using that grit paste and just using one of the stars from that stencil, I'm adding a star into my night scene. After I applied the grit paste, I'm using some of that same antique gold embossing powder and applying that over top of the star while the paste is still wet. Now, if I let this dry and then heated set it, it would have been a little bit more smoother, but I wanted something more textured. So I went ahead and heat set that while the paste was still wet, and that created a really interesting texture to the star. I'm going to layer these pieces down onto my panel, as you can see there, but I first decided I wanted to add a glow around my star. So I used some Wild Honey Oxide inks, and I went around that star with that yellow ink, and then I blotted it up with my dry rag, so that way it just creates a very, very pale halo around the star. To put my scene together, I used some regular adhesive to attach the vellum down onto my background panel, and that background panel is attached onto a red cardstock card base. I also added a little postage seal onto that corner using some Sparrow ink from Simon Says Stamp, and then I popped my entire scene piece on top of that towards the left side of the card using some foam tape. My sentiment was also popped up with foam tape, and now because of course this is a winter snowy scene, I'm using some Ranger's white enamel accents and adding that on top of the pine trees to make them look like there's snow sitting on them. I also used that same enamel accents to add snow falling, so that way it looks like it's snowing inside this entire scene. And then here's a close-up look at the finished card. I really like how all of these elements from the different stamp sets that Tim has created for Stampers Anonymous September release, how they all worked so well together in this one stamp set. And I think this is a really fun set to be able to add to your collection. So I have links to my blog post in the video description below, as well as details on the STAMPtember exclusive release for Simon Says Stamp, and links to all the products that I used as well. You can find all that in the video description below, and if you enjoyed this video, here are 2 more that you might like featuring some other STAMPtember exclusive products. Thanks for watching this video. I will see you again very soon with another one, and have a great day. Bye!